Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player game, Rebirth, designed by Reiner Knizia and published by Mighty Boards, who helped sponsor this video. After everything fell to ruins, the peoples of the world started rebuilding in harmony with nature this time, but they're still competing with each other, of course. And here you'll be trying to control the most land, castles, and cathedrals to lead your clan to victory. There are actually 2 games in this box, and we'll start by learning everything you need to know to play the first one, set in Scotland. And after, I'll cover the adjustments required for the second game, set in Ireland. So, join me at the table, and let's learn how to play. To set up, put this double-sided board in the center of the play area with the Scotland map side face up. The cards with this back make up the mission deck, which you shuffle and set face down onto the space of the board for them here. Each player now collects a player aid, the clan board, scoring achievements and scoring counter, as well as tiles, castles, and cathedral pieces in their chosen color. If you're setting up a game with 4 players, each person goes through their tiles and finds 3 with this energy farm symbol, 3 with these food farm symbols, and 1 with 2 of these settlement symbols, 1 with 3, and another with 4, returning all of these tiles back to the box. Again, you only remove tiles in a 4-player game, which we'll assume we have in this video. But no matter your player count, flip all remaining tiles you have face down and give them a good mix. This is known as your personal supply. From your supply, draw 2. You look at these tiles, but must keep them a secret from the other players. You then set these face down on your clan board. These will not be used during the game, but you can secretly examine your own at any time. Each player now finds their scoring achievement tile with a side that doesn't show a value and slides it into this slot of their clan board. Then move your scoring counter to the 0 space of this score track that runs around the outside edge of the main board. If you only have 2 players in your game, pick one of the unchosen player colors and collect its tiles, setting 1 face down onto each space of the board showing this yellow symbol. Which tiles you pick doesn't matter. These will just act as reminders to ignore these spaces of the map during your game. You'll also find a reminder of which spaces to block off here in the rulebook. Each person now draws one of the tiles from their own supply into their hand to examine privately. Then the last player to visit Scotland is chosen as the first player, or you can pick someone randomly. And that's the setup. In Rebirth, players will add tiles to the board to earn points from building energy and food farms, establishing settlements, castles, cathedrals, and ports, and from completing private missions. Have the most points by the end of the game, and you win. The game is played over a series of turns, starting with the first player, and then going clockwise around and around the table. And on your turn, you're said to be the active player and will perform 3 steps in order, starting with placing a tile. Here, you take the 1 tile you have in your hand and add it to the board. The board has various hexagon spaces. Some are cathedrals with a yellow background and this icon. Others are castles with a pink background and this icon. Others are empty or have what is known as an energy farm or food farm symbol. Spaces with this symbol are settlements, and groups of settlements can have a border around them to show that a single settlement can be made up of more than 1 space. They'll either be made up of a single space, 2 spaces, or at most 3. You'll find a reminder of all the different types of spaces printed here on the board. When performing the place a tile step of your turn, add the tile in your hand to an empty space following a few rules. First, if the tile in your hand shows this symbol, it's a food farm and may be placed into any empty space showing this food farm icon or into any blank space. If you instead had an energy farm to add, which shows this icon, you can put it into any empty space with this energy farm symbol or any blank space. Now here's an exception to keep in mind. If you're trying to place a food farm tile and there are no food farm or blank spaces left on the board, in that case, you're allowed to add it to an empty energy farm space instead. In the same way, if you have an energy farm tile and there are no remaining blank or energy farm spaces, you can add it to a food farm space. Settlements are the last type of tile you may have in hand, and these will show either 1, 2, 3, or 4 settlement icons. No matter how many icons they show, if you have one of these to place, it can only go into an empty space showing one of these settlement icons. It cannot be added to an energy farm, food farm, or blank space. As I had mentioned, settlements can be made up of more than one space, and if a player adds a tile to one of those spaces, then later on, another player can still add one of their pieces to an empty space there, or even the same player could have added one of theirs there later. But just so it's clear, you can never add a token of any type to a cathedral or castle space. All right, that's how you place the tile in your hand onto the board. And when adding tiles in future turns, you don't have to put them adjacent to other tiles you had previously placed. They can go into any valid empty space anywhere on the board. That said, after placing a tile, it's time for the next step of your turn, scoring the tile you just placed. After adding a food farm tile to the board, you score 1 point for it and for each other food farm tile you might have in that cluster. A cluster is any group of farm tiles connected to one another that share the same color. So if I added this food farm tile here, it would score 1 point. It's a cluster of just one tile. If it was later in the game and we had a situation like this, and I added a farm tile here, I would score 1, 2, 3, 4 points since it's a cluster of 4 farm tiles. You'll notice I didn't include these tiles because although they are my color, they are energy farms. And a cluster only counts tiles in your color from the same type. Energy farms score in the same way as food farms, except you count clusters of energy farm tiles. So adding this tile here would score me 1 point, while adding it here instead would score me 1, 2, 3, 4 points. Anytime you earn points in the game, move your marker forward the related number of spaces along this score track. If you ever go all the way around the track, earning 100 points, flip this scoring achievement over to its 100 side to show that you've banked that many points so far, and then continue advancing around the track as usual. If you would reach 200 points or more, replace this tile with your other one, flip to its 200 side, and then flip this over if you earn or pass 300 points. Speaking of which, let's see some other ways to score. If you add a settlement tile to a harbor, which is a space with this points icon beside it, you immediately gain 1 point. Otherwise, settlement tiles added to the board don't score anything until all the spaces of that bordered group are filled. So if I had placed this tile here instead, I wouldn't have scored any points. The exception are single-spaced settlements known as small settlements. They have only one space to fill, so they will score as soon as a tile is added there. The person who filled it adds up their influence over that settlement, which is represented by the number of these settlement icons on the tile they placed. 3 in this case, so they'd score 3 points. If they had added this tile here, they'd only score 1 point. Once a settlement with 2 spaces, also known as a medium settlement, is completely filled, it is scored, but this works a little differently. First, the players with tiles there compare the amount of influence they have within that settlement. Here, blue has 3 and orange has 1. You then refer to this chart of the board and specifically this line that explains medium settlement scoring. The player with the most influence within the settlement scores 5 points, and the player with the least scores 3. If there's a tie for influence within the settlement, then the player who completed the settlement, that is, the last player to add a tile there, loses the tie and scores the lower amount. So in this case, blue would score 5 and orange would score 3. If a single player has their tiles in both spaces, they earn the 5 and the 3 points for a total of 8. When a player adds the final tile to a large settlement, which are made up of 3 spaces, you resolve it like a medium settlement, except now the player with the most influence earns 8 points, second most earns 5, and any other player there earns nothing. Just like with medium settlements, you'll find a reminder of the scoring for large settlements right here at the top of the board. Keep in mind, if a single player has more than one tile within the settlement, they combine their settlement symbols to get their final total influence. And if players tie for influence within a large settlement, like they do here, again, the player who completed the settlement, adding their tile to it last, loses the tie. If there are further ties, which I'm going to set up now, they favor the players in clockwise order from that player. As an example, let's assume these players are seated in the same clockwise order as their pieces within this settlement, and we'll assume that this player added their piece last. They're all tied, and this player added theirs last, so they come in last. The next tie is between these two players, and this one is clockwise from this player, so the tie goes in their favor and they earn the 8 points, and this player earns 5. In large settlements, there is no third place scoring, so this player earns nothing. And don't worry, you'll find a reminder of this tiebreaker rule here on your player aid under the section on settlements. Also be aware, if a single player occupies the entire large settlement, they earn both the 8 and 5 points for a total of 13. Now you might remember, I said that you can't add a tile to a castle space, but the first person to add one adjacent to a castle puts one of their castle pieces onto it to show that they currently control it. If a person later adds a tile beside the same castle space, they check to see who has the most tiles adjacent to it. If there's a tie, the tied players check to see who has the most food and/or energy farms adjacent to it. And then that player gains control. If that means a new player has control, they put their castle into the space and the other player takes theirs back. By the way, if you add a tile and there's a tie for most tiles and for most adjacent farms, the tie is resolved against the player currently adding their tile. So in this case, blue would keep control. You'll find a reminder of these tie-breaking rules on your player aid under the section on castles. And just so it's clear, if you add a tile adjacent to a castle and you have more tiles adjacent to it compared to any other player, it doesn't matter which types of tiles they are, you automatically gain control. This is a cathedral, and like castles, tiles can't be added to them, but the first time you add one adjacent to a cathedral space, you put one of your cathedral pieces on it. You then draw the top card of this mission deck and privately examine it. You can always look at your own missions, but keep them a secret from the other players. These will provide ways you'll be able to score points if you fulfill their requirements by the end of the game, so we'll talk more about these at that time. Each time you add one of your tiles adjacent to a cathedral space where you don't already have one of your pieces, you add a piece there and draw a mission card. Adding a second tile adjacent to a cathedral doesn't add a new piece there or allow you to draw a new mission. There are 8 cathedral spaces on the board, so that means you can gain at most 8 mission cards by having a tile adjacent to each one. Now, if another player adds a tile adjacent to a cathedral for the first time, which another player already has their piece on, they add one of theirs on top, and then they draw a mission card as well. And of course, keep in mind that when you place a tile and score it, you might be resolving several steps. For example, adding this energy farm here scores me 2 points total for this cluster of energy farms. I also have the most tiles beside this castle, so I now control it, and my tile was added beside this cathedral, so I'd put a piece here and then draw a mission card. And that's how you resolve any type of tile you placed on your turn. Afterwards, you resolve the third and final step of your turn by privately drawing a single new tile from your supply into your hand. And then the next player in clockwise order takes their turn. And turns will continue like this around and around the table until every player has placed all of the tiles from their supply onto the board. Remember, at the beginning of the game, they each put 2 tiles onto their clan board. Those don't get placed. After all the other tiles have been placed, then it's time for final scoring. First, check each incomplete settlement, and any players with tiles there earn a number of points equal to the settlement icons showing on their tiles. So red would score 2 points for this tile, and blue would score 3 points for this one. Next, each player earns 5 points for every castle piece they have on the board. Then each player reveals the missions they collected, scoring the points showing at the top of each one if they satisfied the related requirements. If these were my cards, I'd earn 5 points if I occupied the most port spaces. And you'll notice I also earn these points even if I was tied for most. This mission requires the player to occupy the most spaces adjacent to Blair Castle. Castles and cathedrals have names to help you distinguish them, and the dot here on the card gives you an indication of Blair Castle's position on the map. A mission like this doesn't have a requirement. I'd score 3 points just for having it. We won't go through all the mission cards in this video, as how they work is described on them. Once the final scores have been totaled, the player with the most points wins. If there's a tie, the tied player who has control of Edinburgh Castle wins, which is marked with a white shamrock icon as a reminder. If none of the players tied for first place control this castle, the player in control of Stirling Castle wins, even if they weren't one of the players tied for having the most points. So look out, because the player with the least points could still pull off a victory. And with that, we've covered the Scotland board rules. We can now look at the Ireland board. I'm not going to fully teach the rules for it, but this will be a very thorough overview. First off, you'll use this Ireland side of the board, and pay attention because the spaces you block off in a 2-player game are different on this side compared to the other, but again, each of those spaces is marked with a yellow icon, and you'll find a reminder of these spaces here in the rule book. During setup, you'll gather the 12 public missions, which have this back, shuffling and dealing 8 of them face up into a row so it looks something like this when you're done. Put the rest face down on the space for them here on the board. Next, find these round tower bonus tiles, which all have this back. Turn them face down and give them a good mix. Then randomly add one to each of the 14 yellow-backed tower spaces found on the board. When you're done, flip each of these tiles face up so it looks something like this when you're finished. Along with the usual components players collected for the Scotland map, they also each collect one of these doubling markers in their color, adding it to their clan board. And from their supply of regular tiles, instead of drawing 2 of them randomly, secretly examining and placing them face down on their board, they now draw 4 of them. All the rest of their tiles, as before, are then considered their supply. The rest of the game is set up as before, except you leave the mission cards from the Scotland version in the box. They won't be used. Now, placing tiles works as before, but scoring works differently in a few places, which I'll highlight now. First off, harbors have been replaced with offshore farms, but these also immediately score you 1 point for adding a tile to their space. Small, medium, and large settlements work as before, but Ireland has what is known as a sprawling settlement, which is made up of 4 separate spaces. These score as usual, but have their own scoring values, as shown here on the board. Also, keep an eye on these public missions during the game. They each have a particular requirement that you can fulfill, and 2 different values, a higher one and a lower one. If a tile you placed caused you to be the first to complete the conditions of 1 or more of these, you earn the higher point value they show. Indicate this by putting one of your cathedral markers under the higher valued amount and immediately gain those points. Anyone satisfying the conditions of a mission that has already been scored by someone else instead earns the lower value, putting their cathedral marker under it. While only one person can earn the higher value, any number of players can score the lower one. And every player can only score each mission once. The spaces with these tokens are known as round towers, and the first time you occupy a space adjacent to one, you may be eligible to activate its bonus represented by the icon on the token. Just look up that bonus on the back of the rulebook and follow the instructions you find there. This one, for example, allows you to draw your own private mission from this deck that we set on the board during the setup. Each player may only activate each round tower space once, so if the blue player was to put another tile adjacent to this tower, they wouldn't gain its effect again. But more than one player can activate each one, so this player putting their tile here would now be able to activate this tower. The game ends in the same way as when you're using the Scotland side of the board, and then you score castles, incomplete settlements, and private mission cards in the exact same way, and then the player with the most points wins. In the case of a tie for most points, the tied player controlling Blarney Castle wins, and you'll find a little shamrock icon here as a reminder. If no tied player controls Blarney, you then come to the Hill of Tara space, which is this round tower marked with a shamrock icon. And the player occupying the most spaces adjacent to it wins, even if they weren't tied for first place. Now, if there's still a tie, then the tied players at the Hill of Tara share the victory. And that's everything you need to know to play Rebirth. If you have any questions at all about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.